Afternoon, guys. I'm glad I've got you after lunch when you're all suitably anaesthetised to how I'm going to terrify you over the course of the next 20 minutes. Usually when I'm giving this talk, I'm telling other lawyers about it who are naturally really enthusiastic about how we embrace social media, because we're like that. We're very friendly, open people, and I have to sell them on the benefits. But being aware of the audience that I'm talking to today, to show you that I kind of practice what I preach at this kind of thing, I had to show you my geek credentials, my digital native credentials. Allegedly, I am Manchester's most followed lawyer on Twitter. It's not a crown that's particularly heavily fought over, so don't be impressed by that. I use LinkedIn a great deal. I blog for The Drum. I'm part of LexisNexis's commercial editorial board. I'm a director of Manchester Creative Studio, and pretty much all of this opportunity has been made by social media. So whatever I tell you today, however terrified you may or may not be as a result of what I'm going to talk to you about, you know, this is never going to be anything but a positive thing. And it's really refreshing not to have to go through a load of slides from Socialnomics and the latest Eric Coleman video to explain to you why social is great and how it's mainstream, because you all know it is. But of course, with it being mainstream, the message still isn't getting out to a lot of people that the law online works the same way as it does offline. So just to go through the pros and cons from a compliance point of view, obviously you all know social is great for managing crises in real time, to reacting quickly to a breaking issue. It's a great jungle telegraph to gauge opinion. It's a great way to have a real-time connection with your stakeholders, win new ones, build a community around a presence. But of course, with it being the conversation that's happening without you, as Brian Solis will tell you it is, and he's quite right, you'll obviously get negative commentary. Sometimes it can be tough to keep the genie in the bottle. Your target audience will, because we're English, be cynical and sceptical. And of course, if you're going to move towards really embracing this, you're going to need to buy in at every level of the business, but most importantly from personnel and from management. So it creates all kind of new training needs, it creates all kind of new compliance needs, and a consistency of message, usually through a policy, and your values through how that's delivered is increasingly more important. And as I say, I can't stress this enough, the law online works just the same as it would do offline, although the great British public is only waking up to that very, very slowly. So in terms of what you should be thinking about, I'd say data protection very much the new health and safety, and that it's very, very much at the top of most people's agenda at the moment, and it's only going to get more important. Direct marketing, advertising standards, employment, IP, defamation and criminal. So, data protection. You're all in businesses, you will all be governed in some way, shape or form by the Data Protection Act 1998. That covers any use whatsoever by a business of what's called personal data. Personal data is any information from which a living person can be identified, so that's a name, date of birth, a contact detail. Personal data must be only used in line with the Data Protection Act's principles, which in outline are that you must use information fairly and lawfully, use it for specific purposes, it's got to be adequate, relevant and not excessive, accurate, kept up to date, not kept longer than necessary and held securely. So, question, if the Data Protection Act works the way it does, can we reply to a tweet? All of a sudden, are we suddenly going to be prosecuted by the ICO for getting in touch with people? Given Twitter's terms of use, I seriously doubt it. You can certainly tweet proactively. It's probably safer if someone is following you from a direct marketing point of view. Can you use Twitter information for sentiment monitoring? Almost certainly. But when in doubt, it's always a good idea under the Data Protection Act to get consent from anyone to make any kind of use of their personal data. And the ICO has very recently issued some guidelines on when the Data Protection Act applies to social media, to online forums. It says quite clearly, anyone that uses a social media platform, any business, has responsibilities under the DPA. Certainly if you post personal data on your own website or a third party's website, if you download and use personal data from other websites, if you run a website which let people comment or post anything about living individuals, basically any use of people's names, people's addresses, potentially even their IP addresses is something that's going to be caught. So businesses will need to have a very clear and prominent policy for users about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable from a data protection point of view, as well as from a defamation point of view. Have very clear, very easy to find procedures for anyone to whom data relates to dispute the accuracy of a post, to ask for it to be removed, and respond to a dispute very quickly. If anybody ever says to you, my personal information is inaccurate on your website, the first rule has to be, take it down first and ask questions later. Direct marketing. Again, direct marketing engages the Data Protection Act. You need to, when you're direct marketing to people, when you're sending out emails, tweets, whatever, through social media, give what's called fair processing information. You've got to tell people who you are, what you're doing, why you're doing what you're doing, and normally you're going to need explicit consent from people to use their personal data for what's called a legitimate interest. People have a right to object to you using their data. When they tell you to stop, you have to stop. So every email you send out, every social message you send out has to have a stop or unsubscribe link. And you do need to build a black and white list into your databases. This kind of counts for any information you may get across any different platform. And certainly you've got to spell out your intentions in relation to your direct marketing messages to your audience, and if possible, get consent to send them things. Mainly because the delightfully named Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations 2011, this prohibits any kind of marketing, and we say live or automatic calls here, to anyone who opts out. So the basic message of this long-winded slide is, it's best to get people to opt in to receive your marketing messages. Having the whole ticker box to say you may not, if the moon is in a certain part of the sky, object to possibly receiving email marketing from us is not going to work anymore. If you have explicit consent and people say, yes, I'm perfectly happy to receive your messages, that's going to be much better to rely on, mainly because the Information Commissioner's Office is looking at this kind of thing very closely at the moment. And more importantly, as I said earlier, you've got to provide a free and simple means to opt out of any messages going forward, and include a link to your opt out and an unsubscribe in every single email. So failing to tick do not want is not enough, and have a black and white list. Mainly because the ICO is looking for people to go after. Did anybody watch The Call Centre on BBC Three? Anybody willing to admit that they watched The Call Centre on BBC Three? Okay. The Information Commissioner very recently made a £90,000 cold calling fine against a company called DN Design after 2,000 complaints. The call centre, I think was fined a total of around £200,000 by the ICO. So all these pictures you saw of kids in Swansea dancing when they were ringing people about conservatories they didn't want directly led to them getting to have an action taken against them by the ICO. So this is something that they are taking very seriously. Moving on to advertising. Anybody ever had a run-in with the Advertising Standards Authority? You can hear a murmur of I feel your pain in the audience. So the ASA, for those of you who may not know, now actually applies to the vast majority of social media content and online content the same way it used to apply just to print, to TV, to radio advertising. The ASA, as you'll all say, as this slide says, is a self-regulating body. You may say it's toothless. Actually, it isn't as much as you might think it would do, mainly because as of March 2011, the ASA now regulates advertisements, other marketing communications, whether it's clear that it's a marketing communication or not, by or from companies on their own websites and in other non-paid-for space online under their control, directly connected with supply of transfer or goods, services, opportunities and gifts. So that basically means whatever's on your social media feeds is now fair game for the ASA, and they are taking more and more action against online content. If you look, if anybody subscribes to the ASA's bulletins every week, at least I'd say maybe half have something to do with either text, email or online marketing. So the CAP code, again, for those of you who haven't sat and read it before, who don't need a cure for insomnia, basically puts in place a number of different protections against misleading advertisements. Now that's actually backed by a number of criminal sanctions administered by the Office of Fair Trading. And if you get in trouble with them online, there's a new enhanced name and shame policy through the ASA website. They can remove paid for and sponsored search results that link to the advertisement in question and publish the fact that you don't comply with the ASA. So why comply? Because if you don't, it can get you bad publicity. Your adverts will be referred to the ASA. You may be denied advertising space in future. You may eventually be referred to the Office of Fair Trading. You may end up with legal action by your competitors. And as we say, there are some very specific online sanctions. So the ASA draws the line around anything that misleads potential customers, which denigrates competitors unfairly, criticises them without good reason, makes unfair comparisons, pricing errors. But it's important to remember that an advertisement isn't judged on what it actually says, but on what on the regulator thinks it says. In terms of user-generated content, remember this isn't created by you. It falls within the remit if you then take, say, a tweet about how fantastic your business is and put it on your website. You do need to make sure that it's real. That you can substantiate where it came from, and it's always important to have an audit trail. Mainly because, moving on from this to the delightful slide entitled Flogging a Dead Horse, Sony a few years ago were the first people to really get in trouble for this when they came up with an idea that they'd get two kids with hoodies and skateboards to make a viral mashup of a load of different music videos and them skateboarding around wherever they skateboard. Sorry, I'm 36, I wouldn't know where they skateboard anymore. And it turned out that that was actually all put together by a marketing agency. It led to a very big bloody nose for Sony in the eyes of the public, and it may well have also, had it come after 2008, led to action under the Consumer Protection for Unfair Trading regulations, in particular Regulation 3 that prohibits an unfair commercial practice which distorts the economic behaviour of the average consumer, and in particular falsely claiming or creating the impression that you're not acting for purposes relating to your trade, business, craft or profession, or passing yourself off as a consumer. So, whenever anybody tells you, from a marketing agency, I don't know how many agencies are in the room, go and put a load of your own reviews on a website and have members of your staff do it, it's just not a good idea. I've heard that fairly recently, mainly because the maximum penalty is a £5,000 fine, 2 years in prison, or both. Nobody's been prosecuted as of yet, but an agency called Handpicked Media had to give undertaking on their future content back in 2010, and it's been brought to the spotlight very recently. Did anybody see the programme about Coronation Street's stars on Channel 4? About turning up and buying being given some makeup that was actually entitled corporate prostitute in Italian, and they didn't realise. If not, seek it out, because it's a really good way to spend an hour of your time. But the point is, celebrity tweets, celebrity brand ambassadors are big business. The ASA recently investigated the Snickers campaign, You're Not You When You're Hungry, involving tweets from Katie Price, Rio Ferdinand, and a number of others. Eventually, that was cleared by the ASA, despite a number of complaints, due to the fact that everybody's final tweet that the brand ambassadors used contained a hashtag SPON. The reveal, the final picture, was clearly advertising and the only reference to the product. However, this doesn't mean the ASA is just going to let social media content slide. Ask Wayne Rooney, who as part of the Nike hashtag Make It Count campaign was investigated, and actually that campaign brought to a swift end when he tweeted, "My resolution to start the year as champion, finish it as champion, hashtag Make It Count." No hashtag ad, no hashtag or spawn marker. This could confuse the public. Does everybody know that he's a brand ambassador? Only one complaint in this case led to the ASA saying to Nike, pull this campaign. So ask yourself, is the public going to be misled by a social media campaign? And when in doubt, use hashtag spawn or hashtag ad from the first tweet. Now, so in terms of brands and the social web, it's easier to build a brand, but it's also very easy to trade off the back of it for false endorsement to happen. And in particular in relation to domain names, there's actually quite a body of law about a number of people who have previously squatted on domain names. If you don't believe me, ask J.K. Rowling, who managed to get kjrowling.co.uk transferred back to her after a fairly protracted legal battle. But what do you do when someone just doesn't like you or like your brand? What do you do about a hate site? Well, someone who's had particular experience of this was Michael O'Leary from Ryanair. Anybody flown Ryanair before? Anybody enjoyed that experience? Okay. Ryanair had a problem with ihateryanair.co.uk. There was very little they could do about it, because actually what the person was doing by buying that domain wasn't trying to hijack their goodwill, wasn't trying to say that he had anything to do with Ryanair. He just really hated them. And for years and years and years, there was nothing Ryanair could do about that, right up until he allowed someone to buy £300 of advertising space on his site. At which point they were able to take it back off him, because that was him using their reputation, using their name of the business to make himself some money. However, he did set up another website, ihateryanair.org.uk. That's ihateryanair.org.uk. Sorry, Tourette's. In any event, so and they can't touch him. So it just goes to show you, sometimes if someone has a genuine gripe against you, if someone really hates what you're doing, it's better to try and engage them offline. It's better to look at maybe a defamation claim, some other kind of remedy. Cyber squatting isn't necessarily going to get it done for you if it's just a site that really hates you. In relation to copyright, copyright's a big issue on the internet in general, because people assume wrongly that if content's on the web, it must be free for everybody to use. There is a case that suggests, actually, and it's this case, Meltwater. Anybody familiar with this at all? Okay, so this case basically dealt with what happens when subscribers to Meltwater get their Meltwater buzz alert every day, contains a load of links to newspapers. Because those links contain headlines, headlines are now protected as a copyright work in and of themselves, apart from their article. So technically, if you are now sending links to websites of newspapers, you need to pay for a license to do that. So when you're a subscriber to Meltwater, you need to pay not only Meltwater's fees, but also a fee to the NLA. That, in a culture that encourages and is built on link sharing, is fairly terrifying stuff. But another implication is actually a tweet, 140 characters, is potentially now protected by copyright. That doesn't mean you can't retweet anymore. That does mean, though, if you're going to take the content of a tweet and use it outside Twitter's own terms of use, outside of its own ecosystem, it's always best to get some kind of permission. Defamation. In case you weren't aware, we've had a fairly big case on this recently. Anybody familiar with the Sally Bercow and Laura McAlpine case? Excellent, okay. So Sally Bercow, wife of the Speaker of the House of Commons, had something to say about whether or not Laura McAlpine may or may not have been involved in the child abuse allegation in the mid-70s. A lot of people assume that if you say something online, it's actually quite hard to get people to believe that it could affect your reputation. Sally Bercow found out to her cost that it absolutely can. Sally Bercow tried to get around the allegation that she at least hinted at by having a tweet read, "Why is Laura McAlpine trending? Star, innocent face, star." She tried to be clever. The problem is, under libel law, we have something called the repetition rule. By writing that tweet, Bercow was treated in just the same way as if she made the original allegation. Nobody had actually named McAlpine to that point. She was one of the first people to do so. And she'd actually added McAlpine's name into her tweet. So, the way the court saw this was the ordinary meaning of this statement, and that's what you deal with when you look at defamation, what the wording means, whether or not it can affect you in the eyes of the public, showed that McAlpine was a paedophile. Innuendo meaning, which means if you couldn't get it just from the tweet, if you had an idea what was going on around it, was also ruled to be that McAlpine was a paedophile, and innocent face was not a disclaimer. So as much as you say that I only meant it as a joke, the court doesn't see it that way. Sadly, we're not going to find out how much she's going to have to pay McAlpine to make this settle. She was actually offered a chance to settle for £15,000 when the case first got started and turned it down. So that was a picture of Laura McAlpine leaving court. We don't know what she's paid, although there are rumours now that she's having to sell furniture to pay her legal bill. Judge that as you may. Anyway, and now to something that's been in the news recently. Anybody see the horrible tirade of abuse that was aimed at Caroline Criado Perez for trying to get Jane Austen on the back of the I don't need to finish that note, the £10 note. There is a great deal of criminal law that covers social media. The Communications Act 2003, harassment, contempt of court, incitement of racial hatred, although a lot of people don't appreciate that fact. Among them, a guy called Paul Chambers. Anybody familiar with the Twitter joke trial? Excellent, because those of you that aren't, I get to tell this story all over again and swear. So anyway, Paul Chambers sent a tweet reading, "Crap, Robin Hood Airport is closed. You've got a week and a bit to get your shit together, otherwise I'm blowing the airport sky high." He thought this was a great idea. He thought it was funny, right up to the point where Special Branch came and knocked his door down, took his Mac, took his iPad, took his iPhone, and arrested him actually originally under the Criminal Justice Act, but he was originally charged under the Communications Act 2003, the offence of improper use of a public electronic communications network, which makes it an offence to send a message of grossly offensive, indecent or menacing character. It's also an offence to send a message for the purpose of causing annoyance, inconvenience or needless anxiety that you know to be false. That can be a £5,000 fine or 6 months imprisonment. Eventually, on appeal up to the House of Lords, Paul Chambers' conviction was overturned on the issue of whether or not the tweet was actually menacing, but it does go to show you this is old law made at the beginning of the internet's rise to supremacy that is being kit-bashed into shapes for a number of new situations, and the chances are that some of the offences that you're dealing with, certainly the Communications Act 2003, you don't need to show intent to cause any harm to anyone, you just need to show that you sent the message. There is a growing number of cases dealing with harassment. The Protection from Harassment Act of 1997 deals with the course of conduct, something that happens more of once that causes you to feel oppressed, or some kind of unreasonable conduct which causes you fear, alarm or distress. This leads to a 6 months custodial sentence or a £5,000 fine, and was the criminal offence that led to many of the arrests as a result of some of the death threats and rape threats that were made recently against Stella Creasy and Caroline Criado Perez. We also have contempt of court. The Contempt of Court Act 1981, like the Communications Act, an offence that doesn't need intent. If you do it, you're guilty. This covers a publication that could create a risk of prejudice in the course of justice in proceedings that are ongoing, usually a trial. It can cover online commentary. It can apply to archived content. It applies to civil and criminal proceedings. And we have seen some convictions over this fairly recently when the Bulger killers were subject to various new photos of them being posted online. Suspended sentences were given to the people who put them on Facebook. The Attorney General has warned that future offences will lead to prison time. So, obscenity, very, very briefly. The Obscene Publications Act 1959 deals with anything which tends to deprave or corrupt anyone like to see it. The big case on this was about 50 years ago, dealt with Lady Chatterley's lover, but we did see a case involving a blog that described the rape and torture of the various different members of Girls Aloud that very nearly led to the first big obscenity case in quite a long time. So again, just a point, if you do see this kind of information making its way into your feed, it's always a good idea to have an awareness of what criminal offences may apply, because you may want to refer them to the police. The Public Order Act actually goes hand in hand with incitement of racial hatred, and it's always good to do this slide because I get to include a still from the Simpsons movie. And also terrorism. The Terrorism Act 2003 contains a number of offences relating to content which glorifies or encourages terrorism. If anyone ever complains about that to you, if the police ever gets in touch, again, take it down and ask questions later. And riot, dealt with under the Public Order Act 1986. The government thought it would be a fantastic idea to turn Twitter off in case of a riot so that they could just stop news spreading. Of course, they didn't realise that having all of this on would help them in convicting the majority of people. All the people that were convicted as a result of setting up groups on Facebook saying, let's go and riot, led to, I think, 4-year jail terms, which were confirmed on appeal. If nobody looked into some of the tweets around the riots, there was a particularly good picture of a girl wearing a Curry's t-shirt with a policeman who'd arrested her outside the branch of Curry's at which she worked with the TV that she looted from that building. So it just goes to show you, the public really is still getting to grips with the fact that online works the same way as it does do offline. If you're running a forum, if you're running a website, there is something that can help you, however, and that's the e-commerce immunity. If you haven't initiated the transmission of some objectionable content that ends up on your website and you take it down quickly, it's going to make you an awful lot safer. If you're just a link in the chain, or if you're a web provider that hosts this kind of stuff, if you get things down quickly, certainly it's going to minimize any damage you're exposed to, but in certain circumstances, it can also lead to you being completely isolated from any kind of liability for it being up there in the first place. That's also handy to know from the other side of the coin, is that if anyone is saying something particularly nasty about you on a blog, go to their web host, say you as a host are enabling this defamatory, this whatever kind of content. Under the e-commerce regs, they'll tend to take it down quickly and ask questions later. So, in summary, I don't need to tell you this, social media is a good thing. It's important to remember not to do anything online that you wouldn't do offline. Guidelines are certainly key. Having tone of voice policies, having a good compliance set up within your own organisation is going to keep you on the right side of things. And the law applies to you, your messages and your communities as much as it does do to members of the public.